In the 11th century, the world of the Mediterranean was a fractured tapestry of faith and empire. For centuries, a tense and often violent frontier had divided the spheres of Christianity and Islam, running through the heart of the once unified Roman world. On this front line stood the Byzantine Empire, the wealthy but beleaguered heir to Rome's Eastern legacy, its Greek-speaking emperors styling themselves as the defenders of Christendom against a rising Islamic power. That power was the Great Seljuk Empire. Originating from the steppes of Central Asia, the Seljuk Turks migrated westward, embraced Sunni Islam, and embarked on a stunning conquest. With a formidable military built around mounted archers, they reshaped the political map. In 1071, at the decisive Battle of Manzikert, the Seljuk armies shattered the Byzantine defenses, capturing Emperor Romano's fourth Diogenes himself. It was a catastrophe for Constantinople. The heartland of the empire, the fertile plateau of Anatolia, was left open to invasion. Within years, iconic cities steeped in Christian history, like Nicaea and Antioch, fell under Turkish control. The Byzantine Empire, which had stood for over 700 years, was teetering on the brink of collapse. In 1092, the great Seljuk Sultan Malik Shah died, and his vast empire, overextended and built on personal loyalty, began to fragment into rival states. For the Byzantines, this brought little relief. Instead of facing a single imperial army, they now endured relentless raids from independent Turkish warlords and Atabegs competing for territory and plunder along their diminished borders. The empire was bleeding out. By 1095, the Byzantine throne was held by a capable and shrewd soldier emperor, Alexios I Komnenos. He had stabilized the empire's European provinces but could not reclaim Anatolia alone. Looking west, he saw potential aid in the warlike knights of Latin Christendom. That year, his ambassadors arrived at the Council of Piacenza, making a desperate appeal to Pope Urban II. They pleaded for mercenary soldiers to help push back the Seljuk Turks. It was not the first such request, but the timing, the audience, and the man who received it would conspire to transform a simple military aid package into a world-altering event. Pope Urban II was a visionary and a politician. He saw in the emperor's plea not a burden, but a golden opportunity to achieve several monumental goals at once. First, it was a chance to heal the Great Schism of 1054, the bitter rift between the Roman Catholic and Eastern Orthodox churches, by positioning himself as the protector of all Christians. Second, it offered a perfect outlet for the violent energies of Europe's knightly class, whose endless private wars plagued the continent. By redirecting their aggression outward, he could assert papal authority over the often unruly nobility and bishops. And third, it presented the ultimate spiritual objective: to liberate Jerusalem, the holiest city in Christendom, which had been under Muslim rule for over 400 years. In November 1095, at the Council of Clermont in France, Urban unveiled his grand vision to a gathered assembly of clergy and nobles. His sermon was a masterpiece of persuasive rhetoric. He spoke graphically of the desecration of Eastern churches and the suffering of fellow Christians. He called on the knights of Europe to take up arms not for worldly gain, but as an act of penance and holy devotion. Whoever for devotion alone, not to gain honor or money, goes to Jerusalem to liberate the Church of God can substitute this journey for all penance, he declared. He was offering warriors who lived in constant fear of hell for their violent lives the chance to wash away their sins through sacred violence. The crowd's response was electric, erupting with cries of Deus Vult, Deus Vult, God wills it. The call spread across Europe like wildfire, preached by bishops and charismatic populace alike. Thousands from all social classes took the vow. They sewed a cross of cloth onto their tunics, becoming crucis ignati, those signed by the cross. The crusade had begun, but not as Pope Urban had planned. He envisioned a disciplined military expedition led by great lords. What he first got was a chaotic explosion of popular fervor. This first wave, known as the People's Crusade, was led by a fiery ascetic preacher named Peter the Hermit. By the spring of 1096, tens of thousands of poorly armed peasants, townsfolk, minor knights, and even women and children, inspired by a belief that God would simply clear their path, began their journey east. They were unprepared for the reality of the 2,500-mile trek. As they moved through the Rhineland, old prejudices ignited. Some bands, fired by a twisted logic that saw enemies of Christ in their midst, launched devastating pogroms against prosperous Jewish communities in cities like Speyer, Worms, and Mainz. These massacres, though condemned by the Church, marked a dark and tragic prelude to the Crusade. Discipline unraveled further as the mob entered Hungary. Running out of food and supplies, they began looting Christian settlements, fighting skirmishes with local forces tasked with keeping order. By the time a battered and reduced contingent under Peter the Hermit reached Byzantine territory in the summer of 1096, they were seen not as an army of salvation, but as a destructive horde. The Emperor Alexios, horrified, quickly ferried them across the Bosporus into Anatolia. There, in October 1096, ignoring warnings, they marched straight into Seljuk territory. Near the town of Sivtat, they were ambushed and almost entirely slaughtered by the cavalry of the Turkish warlord Kilij Arslan. The People's Crusade was over, a grim lesson in the costs of fanatical zeal without strategy. Meanwhile, the military force Urban had intended was mobilizing. Throughout late 1096 and early 1097, some of Europe's most powerful princes mustered their own armies, financing the expedition through massive loans and the sale of lands. They were not unified under a single commander, but rather a coalition of rival lords, each with their own contingent. The major leaders included the pious Godfrey of Bouillon, Duke of Lower Lorraine, and his ambitious brother Baldwin of Boulogne. From southern France came the wealthy and experienced Raymond IV, Count of Toulouse, accompanied by the papal legate, Bishop Edhemer of Le Pai, the Crusade's spiritual leader. From Normandy came Robert, Duke of Normandy, son of William the Conqueror. From northern France came Hugh, Count of Vermandois, brother to the French king, and Robert II, Count of Flanders. And perhaps the most formidable military mind of them all, the Norman-Italian Prince Bohemond of Taranto, a veteran of countless wars against the Byzantines themselves, joined with his nephew Tancred. These armies converged on Constantinople throughout the winter and spring of 1097. Emperor Alexios was faced with a crisis. He had asked for a few thousand mercenaries. He was instead hosting a massive, independent and hungry host of over 60,000 soldiers, including 7,000 heavily armored knights. His primary goal was the reconquest of Anatolia for his empire, not the liberation of Jerusalem. He needed to bind these volatile forces to his will. Through a combination of lavish gifts, careful diplomacy, and not-so-subtle pressure, he compelled most of the Crusader leaders to swear an oath of fealty. They promised to return to him any former Byzantine lands they captured. Only then did he provide the supplies and naval transport to ship them into Asia Minor. The first major target was the strategically vital city of Nicaea, just across the Bosporus and the capital of Kilij Arslan. The Crusaders, now fighting alongside Byzantine units, laid siege in May 1097. After weeks of fierce fighting, including repelling a major Seljuk relief force, the city was on the verge of falling. To the Crusaders' frustration, the garrison secretly negotiated a surrender with Alexios's agents. The Byzantine banners were raised over the walls, and the Crusaders were denied the plunder they saw as their rightful reward. This sowed the first seeds of deep and lasting distrust between the allies. With Nicaea secure, the Crusader host began the arduous march south across the sun-baked Anatolian plateau in early July. They split into two columns for logistical reasons. The vanguard, led by Bohemond, was ambushed on July 1, 1097, near Dorylaeum by the main army of Kilij Arslan, who was determined to annihilate them as he had the People's Crusade. The Turkish horse archers swarmed the Crusader position, unleashing a relentless hail of arrows. Bohemond formed a defensive perimeter, using the non-combatants and baggage train as a center, and his dismounted knights as a shield wall. For hours, they held a desperate position, taking heavy casualties under the punishing hit-and-run attacks. Just as the line seemed ready to break, the Second Crusader column under Godfrey of Bouillon and Raymond of Toulouse arrived at the battlefield. They did not wait to form up but fed their troops directly into the fray. A decisive charge by Godfrey's knights, emerging from concealed ground, struck the Turkish flank. Believing a new, massive army had arrived, the Seljuk forces panicked and fled, abandoning their richly stocked camp to the Crusaders. The victory at Dorylaeum was a turning point. It broke Seljuk field power in western Anatolia and opened the road east. The march that followed was a harrowing trial of endurance through desolate terrain and scorching heat. At Heraclea, the leaders made a fateful decision. The main army turned southeast into the mountainous Taurus region. Baldwin of Bouillon and Tancred, however, veered southwest with a smaller force into the fertile plain of Cilicia. Their mission was partly strategic, securing supplies and allies, but it was also openly ambitious. Baldwin, in particular, saw an opportunity for personal gain. He was invited by local Armenian Christian rulers to the city of Edessa, far to the east. Through a combination of diplomacy and intrigue, by early 1098, he had engineered his adoption by the city's elderly ruler, and soon after succeeded him as its sole master. Baldwin of Boulogne had become Baldwin I, Count of Edessa, establishing the first of what would be known as the Crusader states. The main army, weary and diminished, reached the ultimate prize of northern Syria in October 1097, the mighty city of Antioch. This was the gateway to Palestine, a city of immense symbolic and strategic importance, with walls stretching for miles over mountainous terrain. It was far too large to fully encircle. The Crusaders settled into a loose siege, hoping to starve the city out. What followed was an 8-month nightmare. The winter of 1097-1098 was one of relentless rain, then starvation. Supplies ran out. Horses died and were eaten. Camp followers perished daily. Morale collapsed and desertions mounted. In December, they managed to defeat a large relief army from Damascus at the Battle of the Lake of Antioch, but it did little to alleviate the suffering within their own camp. The siege became a race against time. A second, even larger Muslim army was being assembled in Mosul under the command of the powerful Atabeg, Kurbagha. The Crusaders' only hope was to take the city before this new force arrived. Salvation came through a combination of treachery and desperation. Bohemond made contact with a disaffected tower commander inside the city named Firuz. On the night of June 2, 1098, a small band of Crusaders scaled ropes up the tower, overpowered the guards, and opened a gate. The Crusader army poured in, unleashing a horrific massacre on the Muslim and Christian Greek inhabitants alike. But the victory was incomplete. The citadel, a fortress within the city, remained in Turkish hands, and just 3 days later, Kurbagha's immense army arrived, surrounding the Crusaders inside the very city they had just conquered. The Crusaders were now the besieged, trapped, starving, and decimated by disease. Their situation seemed utterly hopeless. Emperor Alexios, who had been marching to their aid, received false intelligence that the crusade had already been destroyed. He turned his army back to Constantinople, an act the Crusaders would forever view as the ultimate betrayal of their oath. In this moment of profound despair, a miracle occurred. A simple peasant named Peter Bartholomew claimed to have had visions of St. Andrew, who revealed that the Holy Lance, the spear that had pierced Christ's side on the cross, was buried in Antioch's cathedral. After a public digging, a piece of iron was indeed unearthed. Whether it was a genuine relic or a clever fraud, its effect on morale was transformative. The Crusaders' spirits were reignited with fanatical zeal. On June 28, 1098, against all military logic, the emaciated Crusaders marched out of the city gates to face Kurbagha's fresh and far larger army. They presented a unified front of religious exaltation, with priests leading prayers at the head of the columns. Kerbogha's army, a fractious coalition of rivals, failed to coordinate its attack. Seeing the Crusaders advance with what seemed like supernatural confidence and plagued by internal distrust, parts of the Muslim army began to retreat. This triggered a general panic. Kerbogha was forced to order a full withdrawal, and his camp, with all its vast wealth, was captured. The citadel of Antioch surrendered the next day. It was a victory that defied all explanation, cementing in the Crusaders' minds the absolute certainty that God was guiding their journey. Instead of marching immediately for Jerusalem, the Crusaders spent the rest of 1098 consolidating their position. Arguments erupted over who would rule Antioch. Bohemond, citing the Byzantine betrayal, claimed the city for himself, breaking his oath to Alexios and establishing the Principality of Antioch. Bishop Edhemer, the moral compass of the expedition, died of disease, leaving a leadership vacuum filled by secular squabbles. The horrific massacre of the inhabitants of Marat al-Numan, which included acts of cannibalism reported by chroniclers, shocked even some contemporaries. Finally, in January 1099, under intense pressure from the rank-and-file soldiers who had come to liberate Jerusalem, not carve out fiefdoms in Syria, the remaining princes resumed the march south. They bypassed well-defended coastal cities, entering the territory of the Fatimid Caliphate of Egypt, which had recently recaptured Jerusalem from the Seljuks. The Fatimids, who were Shia Muslims and enemies of the Sunni Seljuks, attempted last-minute negotiations, offering the Crusaders free passage to pilgrimage sites if they stayed out of Fatimid lands. The offer was rejected. The Crusaders' goal was not pilgrimage, but conquest. On June 7, 1099, after a grueling coastal march, the crusading army, now reduced to about 12,000 fighting men and 1,300 knights, caught its first glimpse of the Holy City. Many wept and fell to their knees in prayer. The task ahead was daunting. Jerusalem's defenses were strong. The surrounding countryside had been stripped of food and timber by the Fatimid governor, and the Crusaders had little time before a major relief army would arrive from Egypt. They needed to take the city by storm, and for that, they needed siege engines. A lifeline came when Genoese sailors, who had run their ships aground at Jaffa, dismantled their vessels and transported the precious timber to the siege camp. With this and wood scavenged from the surrounding hills, the Crusaders built 2 massive siege towers and catapults. After a solemn religious procession around the city walls on July 8, 1099, they prepared for the final assault. On the night of July 14, under cover of darkness, they repositioned Godfrey of Bulyon's tower to a less defended section of the northern wall. The attack began at dawn on July 15. For hours, the fighting was fierce and indecisive. Then, from Godfrey's tower, a bridge was lowered onto the ramparts. Knights led by Godfrey's men, including the famed knight Letold, forced a bridgehead. They fought their way down to the gates and opened them from inside. The Crusader army flooded into Jerusalem. What followed was a slaughter of apocalyptic proportions, seared into the historical memory of both East and West. Overcome with religious euphoria, vengeance, and sheer bloodlust, the Crusaders systematically massacred the city's Muslim and Jewish inhabitants. Chroniclers of the time, even those sympathetic to the crusade, wrote of streets running ankle-deep in blood, of civilians chased onto temple roofs and butchered, and of the systematic looting of every house and holy place. It was an act of brutal, terrifying piety, intended to purify the city by destroying its unbelievers. On July 22, a council of princes elected Godfrey of Bulyan as the ruler of the newly won territory. He refused the title of king in the city where Christ had worn a crown of thorns, accepting instead the title advocate of the Holy Sepulchre. The crusade was not yet secure. On August 12, a powerful Fatimid army from Egypt arrived at Ascalon, south of Jerusalem, intent on destroying the invaders and retaking the city. The Crusaders, though exhausted, marched out to meet them. Employing surprise and the crushing weight of a coordinated nightly charge, they routed the Fatimid force, securing their conquest. With their vows fulfilled, most Crusaders returned home in late 1099 and 1100, carrying tales of miracles and triumph. Only a few hundred knights remained to defend the new kingdom of Jerusalem. Pope Urban II died on July 29, 1099, 2 weeks after the city's fall, never knowing the news of his campaign's bloody, spectacular success. The First Crusade was over, but its consequences had just begun. 4 Crusader states, the Kingdom of Jerusalem, the County of Edessa, the Principality of Antioch, and the later County of Tripoli, were established as fragile outposts of Latin Christendom in the heart of the Islamic world. Their survival depended on a divided Muslim political landscape, a condition that would not last. The brutality of the conquest, particularly the sack of Jerusalem, forged a powerful memory of martyrdom and a resolve for reconquest in the Muslim world. Soon, the call for jihad would answer the call of the crusade, setting the stage for nearly 2 centuries of conflict that would reshape the medieval world. The improbable success of the First Crusade was a product of its unique moment, a convergence of Byzantine desperation, papal ambition, knightly avarice and piety, and profound Muslim disunity. It became the defining legend of the Middle Ages, a story of extreme hardship, divine intervention, and shocking violence that would inspire, horrify, and echo for generations to come. That's it for this video. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed, please hit that subscribe button and leave a comment to encourage me for making such content. See you in the next video.